Welcome to Diagnosing Dx, the podcast giving diagnostics the platform it deserves. While therapeutics and devices often take centre stage, diagnostics is the engine driving precision medicine. I'm your host, David Philby, and each week we spotlight the innovators, breakthroughs, and real-world challenges shaping the future of DX. On this week's episode of Diagnosing DX, I'm joined by Mort Minaee, an expert in regulatory strategy with over 30 years' experience across major players like Roche, Abbott, and Guardant Health. We dive deep into the recent FDA rulings on LDTs, what its reversal means for startups, and how to build a credible regulatory strategy that aligns with commercial goals. If you're in diagnostics and navigating the uncertainty, this one is essential listening. Thank you, Mort, for joining me today. I've been super excited about catching up with you. Obviously, we've been in discussions for quite a long time now on a personal level, but thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, David. Good to be with you this morning.
Fantastic. I guess for the benefit of the audience, it would be great to kick off with an intro to yourself and your background, your experience, and I guess what you're currently doing as well.
Sure. Well, I'm currently with my own regulatory consulting practice. I'm the founder and CEO of my own practice, Insightia, regulatory affairs within the life sciences, medical devices, and diagnostics, particularly molecular diagnostics and companion diagnostics. I have been in the industry for 30 plus years. 35 years or so. And I decided to do my own consulting after I'm a former head of regulatory for Detect, a startup company in infectious disease, and former vice president of regulatory affairs at Guardant Health. I have worked for a number of startup companies. Guardant was a successful IPO. Prior to that, I was with a number of larger companies. I've worked for Roche. I was head of regulatory for 454 sequencing, the sequencing solutions business unit. And I've worked at Ventana. Prior to Roche, I was with Abbott Molecular and a number of other companies throughout these past 35 years. I've had the privilege of working with some of the best talents across the large, small, and medium-sized companies within the industry.
Wow, it's like highlight reel, more the career you've had, the companies you worked for, and then going startup and seeing that through to successful IPO, the dream, right? You know, so many people chase that desire, but not everybody can see it through. Can I unpick that a little bit on Guardant Health? What did Guardant look like the day you joined? Where were they? How big? And what was your role when you joined them?
Yeah, I was, as I mentioned, privileged to have been one of the early members of the executive team. Guardant was founded by Amir Ali Tawasaz and Helmi Otuki. They had previously developed another startup, each of them their own startups, which was acquired by Illumina, which is a big player in instrumentation for next generation sequencing technology, as you know. And they came out of Stanford University, and they had a technology, an idea at the time that could address an unmet need, a serious unmet need in cancer diagnosis, late stage cancer, and then later on, of course, the platform is referred to later on as liquid biopsy. It is based on serum, blood-based, non-invasive, and many advantages to the traditional tissue-based diagnosis. Cancer tissue has a very serious issue in terms of heterogeneity of the mutations that drive the cancer. So with the tissue, the accuracy is dependent upon where from the within tumor, what's known as intra heterogeneity, and then between tumors, variability. So it's kind of at the mercy of having picked up the right mutations within the cancer tumor tissue where the mutation actually exists. So because of this variability, the accuracy is not as good as when you're attempting to detect mutations of the circulating tumor DNA. So the tumor, which is known to circulate, shed into the blood system was able to be detected for the first time with this platform. So it was first of a kind PMA. It was a part of our strategy to work with FDA in terms of the breakthrough technology program that FDA had, and we obtained that designation, which expedited our interactions with the agency. And it truly addressed an unmet need in late-stage cancer by finding tumor mutations for which specific drugs could be developed, or some drugs were under development, or some existed. We worked very closely with our partner AstraZeneca and for the initial pre-market approval for non-small cell lung cancer. Of course, the intended use of the platform was to profile the tumor. So there were two aspects to the approval. One was for the first time, the regulatory paradigm had to address a technology that doesn't detect just one single event, but profiles the tumor in terms of variety of mutations that could be driving the cancer, especially late-stage cancer, for which now the patients had multiple opportunities to match their tumor mutation to what's known as precision medicine. So this is targeted therapy, and the platform technology allows to identify the targets.
Wow. When you joined Guardant, did you know it was going to be as successful and as special as it has become, or was it highly speculative and it was exciting, but there was still so many questions to be answered?
Very good question. You never know
Right.
when you join a startup that is going to be successful, but you certainly hope, but hope is not the best strategy. I spent a good amount of time trying to make sure that I understood the technology and its potential. And then most importantly, the founders of the company. At some point, many conversations I had with president at the time, smaller group, of course. Back then, I think there were, I don't remember exactly, 35, 40, mostly scientists at the company. And now I think Guardant is a couple of thousand, if not more. I don't know. But I knew after those conversations that I can certainly work with the level of enthusiasm that I saw in the founders when they were talking about the technology, but also the wherewithal about, the space that they were going to be introducing and commercializing the product. I mean, at the time I was with Roche, a big company. I mean, the biggest cancer therapy and diagnostics, the biggest diagnostic company. And they were pretty active in the same area. And, so this little company was going to take on Roche. But, Roche actually acquires, and most of these big companies acquire these innovative startup companies. And so it would have been, I think it was probably a target for acquisition, but these guys knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the capabilities of their technologies and their abilities to attract the right team members and build the company. And it was just a fantastic journey that I had with them. Yeah, at some point I knew, I got convinced that they're going to make a big difference, and I want to be part of it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Regulatory speaking, when you joined the company, how robust was their regulatory strategy at that point, or was it super exciting science, needed a lot of regulatory work?
Yes, it was super exciting science. It was in the midst of deciding whether the company wants to be an FDA approved product company or LDT, lab developed tests.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about LDTs, of course, later on. But a lot of startup companies in the diagnostics, when they offer testing services, ask themselves whether they want to be a testing service company that also develops their own niche technology, or they have already done so and they want to open up a CLIA certified lab as a practice of medicine, so to speak?
Yeah.
Or do they want to obtain FDA approval? And why would they want to do that? Besides the fact that at the time, FDA has attempted to regulate LDTs several times. I mean, this is an issue that has been going on for a few decades. And every time, of course, it makes the labs nervous and some IVD companies excited because they always felt that there was not a level playing field because they had to go through the burden of FDA. And then some of these startup companies would come up with a Me Too product and they don't go through it. So we were debating whether we should do this, whether we should do both, and how does that align with our business model? Which business model would be supported with which regulatory pathway, and which would be most attractive to investors, and reimbursement, payer strategy, CMS reimbursement, and private CMS reimbursement and private payers. So it had all these multiple aspects and the credibility and all that stuff when you get an FDA approval. So we talked about all of those things as we were developing our business strategy. So it wasn't like a business strategy was solid in place and then the regulatory had to support that. But it was a regulatory, business, commercial, reimbursement, all intertwined and coming together to create the best scenario for a successful business plan for both attracting investment as well as long-term market presence.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Obviously, I speak to people across regulatory, reimbursement, commercial all the time, and they all think they're the most important department in the room. And the reality is they're all right. You need them all to be on the same page if you're going to make it work. You can't have great science without everything else. It just falls down, you know?
Absolutely, David. It's a team sport. It's not tennis or golf. It is basketball or football.
That's the spirit, yeah. So we were going to talk about the FDA's update on LDTs. It's certainly a moving target. We seem to be getting updates quicker than we thought, actually. And so I'd love to sort of, if you want to kick us off, because we've just had an update really recently. What's the most recent update? And I guess the history of this. What is the problem that's being tackled here? And we'll get into it. At Alevra Consulting, we focus on DX only, supporting early stage and growth companies achieve their milestones by solving their biggest talent challenges. Have you ever suffered from working with a talent partner who was either life sciences or med tech and dabbling in diagnostics? Or no more? Work with a diagnostics specialist talent partner.
Yes, let me say a little bit of a history behind this, and then I will give you an update. FDA has been trying to provide a level playing field across all tests and diagnostics, whether they are developed by manufacturers, traditional manufacturers that provide a test kit and sell it across interstate commerce, and some of these labs that also develop their own tests would buy these tests. And then there are tests that are developed by labs themselves, and they're referred to as lab developed tests. And traditionally, FDA has been looking the other way as far as FDA review and approval of those tests, because older tests were much simpler and it allowed for labs to develop tests for some of these rare disease or tests that larger companies may not have gone after those diseases. So this was intended initially for that. But of course, over the decades, technology became more advanced and tests became more sophisticated and complex, and the level of risk increased. So FDA thought that enforcement discretion was the policy that they looked the other way. Was no longer, an appropriate policy for risk mitigation of the newer tests. And they attempted to regulate these. They attempted this by issuing guidance documents first, and of course the whole industry, lab industry, was up in arm that guidance was not appropriate. They thought. What was many arguments, of course. One was purely procedural. Regulating under guidance is not the way to bring products under FDA's umbrella. It would require another process, which would be the rulemaking process. And that's why FDA issued ultimately this painful process of rulemaking, painful from FDA's perspective, long, and lengthy. So they issued back in May 24 the finalized rule to regulate LDTs, and it would have been implemented in May 2025. The 4-year transition period to end in 2028. So I say it was to be implemented in May 2025. So technically, it was a rule that was in place with the caveats that they got lost. There was a lawsuit which everybody expected that there will be a huge challenge to this, and AMP and the ACLA both jointly did the lawsuit. The American Clinical Lab Association and the Molecular Pathology, and the federal court, district court in Texas, vacated the rule. So vacating the rule is a legal term, meaning that they nullified and invalidated the rule. We'll talk about this a little bit more later on in terms of next steps and what needs to be done, but that is the latest right now.
But this is not the end of it.
This is not the end of it. This is still going.
Okay. You touched on it, but why is it such a big deal for the diagnostics market? It feels like you have top of a food chain stand to benefit quite a lot from this. A lot of powerful companies that can benefit quite a lot from this added regulation, and smaller companies, stand to benefit from the current landscape and what's ultimately been decided now. But how can this impact, or what's the impact on that's going to be, especially for startups in diagnostics? Because it feels like the impact could be severe, right?
Well, the impact would be different for startup companies than large companies. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, you hear larger companies or kit manufacturers complaining that this is not a level playing field. So the impact for some of the other manufacturers who were actually pro this rule was that now everybody will be regulated under the same regulations. Of course, the argument from the other side was that this is a clinical service we're providing and not building a medical device for selling to other companies. So we are already under CLIA regulations. CLIA regulations is a set of regulations that is overseen by Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, and they have license to operate the lab, and their operations are regulated. So the argument has always been that that set of regulations is targeting the operation of the lab, not product development that is also ongoing in these labs. So that part of it is unregulated and without any third-party review and approval like our products are. So that was the basis of the lawsuit, of course, that this is not a product, this is a clinical service. However, we'll talk about that part later. The question that you asked is about the impact. If all products are under the same regulations, then LDTs will not be commercialized as fast as they are, because now we have to go through clinical study, their analytical studies, and there are dozens of studies to characterize the performance of an assay, and then of course establishing the safety and efficacy with the standards of FDA for review and the submission of it, and the pre-market approval and the quality system. This is an entirely another layer of quality management on top of their QA system for lab operation. This would be, a quality system level of processes that are intended for product development, design controls, and all those activities that materialize in the final product. So the burden is much higher, and the time, the lengthy time for approval and the budget that would be required for this. So startup companies would have to be asking for more funds to do this, and they will not be as nimble as they like to be. So it's a huge impact.
I mean, even more so today, right? Because, I mean, if this had come in last month, a lot of the early stage companies that I've spoken to this year, there's a lot of companies who are really ceasing clinical trials, taking cost out of innovation R&D teams to load up their commercial teams because they need to generate revenue to survive right now because funding is tight. And a lot of them are being caught off guard that they thought there would be extra funds available and there isn't. And so they're having to commercialize quicker and bigger just to sort of stay afloat right now. So if this rule had come in, surely the impact directly on that sort of, the early stage, maybe sort of seed stage company would probably have been, pre-Series A. Them companies would have really suffered. We would have seen such a backlash in the market of layoffs and bankruptcies and stuff in companies that needed to commercialize through LDT just to survive for the next 6 to 12 months.
Yes, you are right. I mean, it does impact their bottom line. That it impacts how soon they can begin to recognize revenue because, it doesn't take them the year or two of interactions with FDA, and they can launch products and begin to bring revenue much faster. So, any startup company with an LDT pathway as their business model had to be thinking about attracting additional investment and also providing a clear business plan, regulatory plan for the VC community that would not be very comfortable with an uncertain regulatory landscape. So these startup companies, and continue to today, they need to have that clear story. So one of the strategies that we considered as an LDT company that wanted FDA, not because we wanted it just to be compliant, because we were anticipating FDA enforcement, but really when we thought about it, we had a model that wanted to accommodate early revenue by LDT in parallel with, we want a version of our test that would benefit from the credibility of FDA approval,
Right.
to have a regulatory model and strategy that would remove some of that uncertainty from the perspective of the investors so that they could see that there is a current source of income, but there is a broader perspective by this team to address reimbursement. And one of the first things that we did was to align our regulatory strategy with our pricing strategy because the test was very innovative and intended to be offered by Guardant Health itself and not sold as a kit to other manufacturers. We could benefit from a policy that is referred to as Advanced Diagnostic Lab Test, ADLT. And ADLTs have a benefit of setting their price pretty much at sticker price as opposed to non-ADLTs where pricing is set by averaging out and walking the product and technology to what exists, and then these fee schedules that set the price. So your price would be, as opposed to, a sticker price for a technology that a lot of investment has gone into it, as opposed to, averaging out with some of the cheaper tests in the market. And so it had a clear advantage in pursuing the FDA for that reason. The credibility, as I mentioned. So all of this came together as, yes, let's pursue a parallel path. And today, many companies that are well capitalized, I would say, and then, planning well, would pursue something like that. So it's something seriously consider, even in light of the current status of the policy.
So what happens next in terms of, as we said at the top of the call, this is not the end. Do we expect sort of just an ongoing legal battle now and a push and pull, and or is there clear sort of horizons for the time being until it comes up again?
So not all stakeholders are unhappy about. I mean, so of course the lab industry is happy about not having to
Yeah.
deal with this, but there are some patient advocacy groups and others that would like to see all products, all tests, see the same level of regulatory oversight. So they're pushing for it, and as I mentioned, also there are manufacturers that would like to see a same level of treatment from regulatory bodies. So there will be a number of scenarios that one could envision. One would be that FDA could issue another rule. So this rule was nullified, so they cannot enforce the rule that has been issued as final rule. But that doesn't mean that FDA couldn't issue a different rule or revised rule, and then this process will be ongoing. Another thing that has been ongoing actually was the congressional reaction to this. So all throughout, there has been some attempt to, and even FDA wanted this, for Congress to address this through a new law. Basis for this nullification and the argument in the lawsuit has been that FDA has gone above and beyond its jurisdiction because of the very definition of medical device and the interpretation of medical device as defined in the law in FDNCA, Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act. The device and interstate commerce drives that definition, where the argument has been that these are clinical service and not devices.
Right.
So this has triggered the need for changing the law, not the regulations that are underneath the law, supporting the law. So it required act of Congress. And act of Congress, the process to introduce a new law is, of course, much more complicated than even the lengthy and burdensome implementation of a new rule. So there has been a couple of attempts. There was a proposal this year's Ballot Act.
Yeah, I'd heard about this.
Didn't make it that far, but this was one attempt by both houses to bring all of these products under one definition called in vitro clinical tests, so that test products, whether they are developed by manufacturer or by a lab, would be considered in vitro clinical tests and treated the same way by law. And there may be a chance that Ballot Act will be reintroduced or adopted. There is a chance that FDA would initiate a new act, proposal for new law. So there are those potentials. So there is uncertainty. That's the point, is that if I was a lab or a startup company considering a business plan as a lab test, I would have to consider this uncertainty and how to address this uncertainty, especially if you're going out there and trying to attract investors in light of this uncertainty.
Well, I think that was going to be my next question. Are investors spooked by the well, I assume they are spooked by the uncertainty, but I guess a more relevant recent question would be, are they less spooked by what's been recently decided, or are they still cautious about, hang on, this might not be the end of this? So if I'm investing in a company whose business plan is, focused on a lab developed test early, in the near future, and that will be generating revenue, then actually that might not come to fruition. What's the current landscape there with how investors see it?
Yeah, so caution is the key term. I think they will be cautious about it. Different VC firms may react differently, but the perceived risk is now higher because of this regulatory landscape uncertainty, and it will be a process that would not be as fast as you would expect. Now, the scrutiny of these startup companies would need to have a clear story to tell in light of this uncertainty, so that if they have a strategy that and demonstrate capability that they could address this, or they are already pursuing FDA approval regardless of this because of some of the reasons that I mentioned to you, because they want to have their product be viewed as the more credible product with FDA stamp of approval, because they want to have a stronger market presence, because they want to have a stronger payment strategy, pricing strategy. So if they know all of these different aspects that are implicated by this regulatory environment, and they can demonstrate that to the investment community, I think they have a better chance of attracting funding, even in light of the uncertainty. Of course, these are venture capitalists, so there is no 100% certainty. They understand that. But when it comes to regulatory and the uncertainty, they want to make sure that the startup company has some clue about what's coming. And if their strategy is ignoring all these complex issues from legal, regulatory, reimbursement, insurance payment, all of these moving parts, you would have to have the right team, the right regulatory and all other functions beyond the technology. You could have the most wonderful technology, but if you don't have the wherewithal to get through these maze of different aspects, both from marketing perspective and the other aspects as I mentioned. So those are the implications, and that's what it takes.
Was it known that if it had come into play in May as expected, would the FDA have retrospectively applied it, in that if companies were already commercialized, generating revenue through their lab developed tests, would they have to go back to the start of an FDA process, or would it have only been implemented for new tests coming to market?
Right. Well, this was actually phasing out their policy of enforcement discretion. So there was some grandfathering, and initial phase, it wasn't immediately a submission to FDA with a pre-market product dossier, and it started with what they viewed as more appropriate to address risk. So there was different aspects of the regulatory oversight would have been introduced in a schedule of a 4-year period.
Okay. Interesting. So startups right now that have been given this green light to continue, what should they be doing in terms of, should they just be moving on with their lives and operating as is, or is there steps that they should be taking, considerations they should be taking for what could still come up, and how should they be preparing and sort of staying informed on that?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, they should consider this in their broader business strategy. So a startup company that was exclusively intending to be an LDT for some reason would have to consider that this could come up again in a new rule. Vacating of the previous rule goes away, and there will be some modification of the previous rule, and there will be support from, as I mentioned, advocacy groups and others, stakeholders, that they would want to consider, would they want to be just an LDT test, or would they want to actually be an FDA approved and also be launching their products in other regulated markets? Because if you're going to be a global company, then you have, for example, Europe, which also changed the regulations. Of course, there was a time when we went to Europe first because it was easier. We launched products in Europe, because Europe was, for years and years, on a, uh, 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 self-certification basis.
Mm.
You didn't have to convince a third party. You convinced yourselves, and you didn't have the same time burden and the level of cost. So you definitely targeted Europe first, or other regions that allowed a less burdensome pathway. But Europe is changing. They never use the term LDT, lab developed tests, but they did have a version that hospitals where they offered services, they developed tests. And so the IVD regulations addresses this this loophole that also existed there. So if you're intending to launch products in Europe as well as the US, then it will pay to have that level of study and data available so that you could pivot and have CE mark for your product and be able to commercialize in other targeted markets. So it depends on your business strategy and your horizon, and your commercial strategy and reimbursement. Whether you would be happy with pricing that it's raising the bar on regulatory, but it also raising the bar on the level of perceived quality and reimbursement.
Interesting. So it's tread with caution. This is not the end. There will
This
be.
is not the end.
Yeah.
I don't think this will be the end. I think the uncertainty remains.
Yeah.
To address the uncertainty and attract capital, you want to consider this seriously. Of course, the complexity that the recent vacating of the final rule introduced now goes beyond future products, but it touches some existing products, and we can talk about that later. But
Yeah, that's interesting. And so, anything to sort of that companies should be looking out for over the next sort of 6 to 12 months that's set, or is it more just this something could happen at any time that they just need to be aware of?
well, I don't have a timetable when this may happen, but if I was a startup company, I will not want to wait for something to happen and then react to it. You need to be taking some
No.
measures now and align your business strategy with this landscape and have a clear, well demonstrable strategy to the investment community that even though this rule has been vacated, it's not being enforced, but because it has potential for either a new law or a new rule, then this is what we're doing. Or we are doing this not just because we want to be compliant, but because we want to benefit from the benefits of this.
Yeah.
One of the strong benefits of being under FDA regulation for innovative technologies. Innovation comes from startup community. So you want to get to the market as fast as you can.
Yeah.
Not always FDA is as slow as, we want them to be as fast as possible, but there are programs at FDA that would expedite these review processes. So one of the programs that, as I mentioned earlier, was the FDA's Breakthrough Designation Program, which would give your review priority, and it would put additional resources on the FDA's side to the project. And then by that designation, you would be considered for a better payment reimbursement.
Mm.
So there are advantages there that you will lose out. Those advantages, just give those up by wanting to pursue a less burdensome approach. So it all depends on your, your business model and what you're going after, and whether it makes sense for your product to be offered as a service.
Yeah.
Or do you want to package it up as a FDA approved product for those reasons beyond just compliance?
Yeah. Makes sense. Mort, this was fascinating. Thank you for taking the time to come on and share your perspective, because it's
My pleasure.
incredibly valuable, and obviously your experience puts you in the best spot to speak on this, but also the fact that you're now consulting with startup and early stage companies. I'm sure you're having these conversations on an ongoing basis. This was super insightful, and I think actually speaking to some companies, I've got the feeling that some clients think that they're now in the clear, and actually they're not, so it was super insightful. I really appreciate you coming on to speak on this really hot topic.
It's been a pleasure, David. I highly recommend with departing thoughts for companies, startup companies that are considering launching products in this uncertain environment to engage with a consultant that specializes in this field and have a plan, one way or the other, a very clear plan, so that your investors have a clear understanding that you do have a clear understanding of the environment, and your strategy is in light of your understanding, your clear understanding of what you're getting into.
100%. Thank you so much, Mort. That was absolutely awesome.
It was a pleasure, David, as
Thank
always.
you.
Thank you.